descent. Bill is a graduate of the University of Lethbridge Business Administration program. Any other U of L alumni out here besides me and Bill? Awesome. And he's the consultation manager with the Stoney Nakoda Nations. Bill is also an advisor to the Chiniki Lecture Series at the University of Calgary, to the Thinking Mountains Conference and the Canadian Mountain Network Initiative with the University of Alberta. In September 2017, Bill accepted the Ted Smith Conservation Award from the Yellowstone to Yukon organization on behalf of the Stoney Consultation Department. And Bill, in his conversation with us this morning, will be talking about the 2016 Stoney Nakoda Nation Grizzly Report and its shift towards implementation, and we're really looking forward to having that presentation. So without that anymore, I'll give it over to Glynis.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, again. I thought I'd try this speaker, so I haven't done it before. Okay, so like Perry said, thank you, Perry, for the introduction. We are presenting on the collaboration and engagement with Indigenous groups and the government of Alberta. So just a little bit of background, and I'm going to get into it. This picture is of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan First Nation table, and I'm going to go way more into detail, but I just wanted to showcase how we really trying to, if you see one of the nations is leading, she's facilitating the discussion. So I'm going to get into that. I just really wanted to, this picture really represents how we really make sure the collaboration with the table is at the center of every one of when we get together in our meetings. Okay, so I know I'll say the UN deck because it's a lot to say, but we already said that in my introduction, we're renewing the relationship. Alberta's renewing the relationship on the principles of the UN deck with Indigenous people, because we want to make sure there's trust, respect. It's all honored with Indigenous people. But I want to also, hold on, sorry. Oh, sorry, okay, I got it. So I just wanted to, the UN deck, it's so important because, it's about, the UN deck represents protecting, Indigenous culture and the unique identities of First Nations, Indigenous people in Canada. Well, I mean, it's worldwide, but, just a sec, guys, I'm sorry. Sorry, do you want to just come up here? Really, I'm just having trouble with my speaking notes. I can't find I don't know what happened. Okay, so then if I do, okay, that's actually much, if you can make it, yeah, that's right. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, slight technical issue. Okay, so back to the UN deck. So I know that everybody's aware of it. We're aware of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. But what I wanted to make sure that everybody understands as planners and to Indigenous people why it's important is because it took First Nations 11 years to add that S to peoples to the United Nations, right, to recognize that there's First Nation, Métis, Inuit people. So there was a lot of struggles to make this happen. They even went on a hunger strike to create the awareness of what was happening. It's important for that everybody understands the term Indigenous peoples are meant to be is an inclusive umbrella that includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. It took over, I'm really struggling with this. It took over 30 years to draft the United Nations, the UN deck. So the expectations are high. And the United Nations, the UN deck was endorsed at United Nations in September 2017, and it was in Canada recognized it 3 years later on November 10th. So today, Alberta is recognizing the UN deck. So I just wanted to make sure that people like understand like the value, like how important it is dear to heart to Indigenous people. Because I know like a lot of people will, they'll read the documents and they'll find a statement that aligns with the work they're doing, which is really important. But just to recognize the, like the really close work that people did to get there. So that's what I really wanted to focus on. Okay, so what I wanted to do is talk about one of the models that I'm talking about is the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, or SSRP. I'm going to refer to that in my presentation. So this table, and this is what I'm focusing on. So within the regional plan here, there is a strategy, it's within there, and it's so the specific strategy says to create a table that emphasizes the inclusion of Indigenous people in land use planning, to ensure that they have a voice at the table when it comes to natural resource and land management decisions. So a bit of history is that the table was created in 2015. And at the table we have all the Treaty 7 nations, so Blackfoot, Blood Tribe, Piikani, Siksika, Tsuut'ina, and all the Stoney Nations, Wesley, Bearspaw, and Chiniki. And from Treaty 6, we have where I'm from, Samson, and we have the rest of the Musqueam Nations, Louis, Bull, Montana, and Ermineskin. And we also have Sunchild and Ochees who sit at the table. So and I'm going to go more into when we get and we meet and engage with them. But these 13 nations, we meet with them, and they create the First Nation table. And what it's important to recognize, so this is the map of SSR, but you guys probably know that Musqueam is not located in this area, right? But what I want people to understand is that even though it's not located in SSR, they practice their traditional rights as Indigenous people, First Nations people within that. So that's why we honor and recognize and have them at the table as part of, so they're part of all our discussions. Okay, so I'm gonna get into our table itself. So this is what we call the First Nation inclusion model. And this was actually developed by those 13 nations over a period of discussing, meeting over about 2 years. This is where this model came from. It was created by the nation. So when we talk about co-creation, collaboration, this is what the table has created. And what I want to show to you is, so if you look at the center, it says First Nation inclusion, incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge, treaty rights, and traditional land use, cultural and community-based monitoring, Indigenous stewardship practices. So what that means is that at every one of our meetings and anything that happens with these 13 nations, we really make sure like these are the center of our discussions. We talk about TLUs, we talk about treaty rights, and treaty is such important. And what I love about it is that these themes that the table has created, because this is how they center their conversations around biodiversity and land management, social economic issues, air and water, and this is what they became their vision for the table, acted in good faith. And it's also part of, so whenever we have meetings for regional planning, this is at the center of all our discussions. So with the table, the success of this table is because it's a forum for First Nations, and First Nations, so these nations will bring their technicians, elders and youths and traditional knowledge holders to all of these meetings. It's also with the government of Alberta, so some of the cross-ministry that also make up the table is Indigenous relations, environment and parks, Culture and Tourism, Energy, Agriculture and Forestry, and the Land Use Secretariat, and Alberta Energy Regulator to discuss implementation of overarching air, land, water, and biodiversity management with the table. So this is what we're doing is we're exploring new approaches for the application of TEK and Indigenous stewardship practices. And what we'll do at the table is we're trying to figure out best practices, areas of alignment that the cross-ministry and the First Nations can do to work together. And one of the best I love about this table is like the focus is to build relationships between the nations and cross-ministry with the government. So I wanted to get into the table itself. So like I said, that we meet with 13 nations, and each of these meetings, we commit to at least five meetings per fiscal year, and there's funding. Each of these nations get about $24,000 to attend these meetings, and there's a work plan that we collaborate together on. And I just want to get through, because really what makes the table so important is the power of the relationships that the nations have with each other, and that we, like the government of Alberta staff, have with the nations. So really what's important, super important, and I can never stress this enough with anybody working with Indigenous people, is to honor cultural protocol. And what we do is with all our meetings, we open it up with a pipe ceremony. So it's a 2-day meeting that we typically have. Well, most of the time they're in Fish Creek Provincial Park because it's center. Wesquachis has a couple hours to drive to it. Blood Tribe, we're trying to get them there. Just trying to think about the space, like where people are coming from. So we usually have them in Calgary. And what happens is when we have these pipe ceremonies, it's really important because what happens is one of the nations will lead it. Like that's what we've kind of been doing, is each nation will lead a pipe ceremony. But the also amazing thing is, because it's also about cultural awareness and growth of our GOA staff, is GOA staff participate in it. So it's really amazing. So for some people, it's not every day that you see a pipe being shared with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So that's why we always make sure that people understand like the honor this is to sit with elders and share a pipe with them. So I was talking about earlier, so those cross-ministry teams that I mentioned that we work with. So what happens is at these meetings, we have the agenda. We'll go through it, all the cross-ministry teams. They'll submit their implementation that they're working on or upcoming work, such as the flood mitigation, or just recently, the bison statusing that you've seen in the news. So these are groups that will come to the table to get the input of the nations, right? It's not a consultation table, so I just want to make sure that's really important. It's information sharing. So what they'll do is implementation teams will have the opportunity to present to 13 nations and provide basically an overview of what projects they're working on and what is the opportunity here. It's because they get to do the relationship, right? Like some people might have not have worked with any of the 13 nations yet, or some of them have, but it's really an opportunity to have that space at the table, and then we can have a lot of dialogue, thoughtful dialogue, respectful, and just learn about how does treaty rights, how are my treaty rights being impacted by this development? What is the government going to do to make sure that TEK is honored and protected? So these are some of the discussions that we have. And then out of that table, so it centers around a lot of this conversation. And then the project teams, they'll have that opportunity to present. East Kananaskis Ghost Footprint Plan was on our last agenda. And then also on that last agenda, we have the Indigenous Knowledge Policy, which is an initiative I'm going to speak to later. But what I want to emphasize is the collaboration about this table is that we co-create this table together. I guess I'm more in a role of facilitating the agenda, but it's the nations who say, this is what we want to hear, Glynis. They'll say, they'll phone and say, this is really important that's coming up, and we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to hear from government on that. So we always will do our best to bring in speakers, presenters, GOA, could be external people. The last presentation we had Dr. Leroy Littlebear, and I'm sure people know him. But we have a lot of Indigenous leaders, non-Indigenous leaders, and cross-ministry. They come in to present to the table. I always feel like whenever these table meetings happen, why they're so interesting is because it's almost like cultural camp. Any of you guys been to land-based learning? This is how I always feel about it. Because I'm learning from different nations, 13 different nations, on their insight and perspective on these. But they're also, what's the beauty of these table meetings too, is they can speak in their own language. And I just love hearing our people speaking in Blackfoot, Stoney, and Cree, right? So they're speaking in their language. Elders, they'll speak to each other in their language. And they're sharing with the youth. And I don't know, I always get emotional because I just think that's so beautiful. That's what I love about this table, because we really honor who they are as Indigenous people. So that's what I wanted to emphasize, is that, honoring for them the ability to speak in their language. It's because then they'll say how they feel, and then if sometimes the struggle is if they can't say it in English, they'll say it in their own language. But also, which is I totally appreciate, is they'll also translate it for us of what they said. But it's really amazing. And like I mentioned, we do fund each of these nations, and what they do is they submit a work plan. So this is where they'll think about all the upcoming projects. They'll work with government on implementation within the SSR. So it could be like writing on stone. The most recent Porcupine Livingston draft management, those plans, recreation footprint management plans that were just in the news. So those are work that they'll collaborate on, and the funding is not enough. I've already been told, and which I realize. But that's to help them with travel and to support them. So that's what we work with the nations on. Okay, so these are, when I was talking about the meetings that we set up, at least 5 meetings a year. So this is the Elders and Youth Royal Cafe poster in 2017, and this was held in Calgary. And if you can see, we hired a visual facilitator, but when we had over 100 people attend, and all the nations attended, and we had breakout sessions on those 5 themes that I mentioned earlier. And then she captured them, but really what was so validating and the nations appreciated is to see their, what they thought captured on visual facilitation. And since then, this poster, this was the outcome. Since then, this poster over time, and it's huge, it's a really huge poster. This is basically, it forms our work. So whenever I work with implementation teams, I ask them to take a look at this so it can help spark the dialogue that they have when they're working with the First Nations Métis. And so this is the work that came out of it. And then again, we just hosted a Elders and Youth Royal Cafe this year in Lethbridge. And this is the nations who showed up, their elders and youth that they brought. And this is right beside Galt Museum. So that's where we're located. And then with this teepee, what I wanted to emphasize about the SSRP table, because I said we honor and respect their, everybody's identities, is that it's remember when I said that it's like a land-based teaching opportunity? So we're always getting people, they take us on walks, or they'll have the opportunity to share who they are, like their nation, what's important to them. So that's what we really want to make sure that we honor that. Okay, just a sec, I gotta get this working. Okay, I'll play that again for you. So this is really what I want to emphasize. When I said that we respect and honor the cultural, what really is important for them. So this was a teepee that we put together. You know, like I said, we have pipe ceremonies, but we also honored it by setting up a teepee with the nations who were there. And this is a Blackfoot style teepee because we're in Blackfoot territory. And it's also about, like, really, like, because I did not emphasize it much, is honoring the nations, like, who they are. So they really, we always make sure that we're incorporating some land-based teaching into all our meetings. So even then, after that teepee was built, we had meetings in there. Like, we had breakout sessions that were in the meeting. So that's Karen Smith-Fargy. She works with the government. And that's Kyra Northwest, and she works for Samson Cree Nation, and they're collaborating on culture-based monitoring, which is like for Samson, that's what they're using their funding for. So that's the picture of that. So the draft SSRP TEK principles. So these TEK principles, they've been basically in development since the table existed. What these principles do is they show what's important for the nations. You know, at table meetings, what we'll do is we'll tell people this is what our meetings are based on. This is what's important to the table. You know, like recognizing they're diverse and unique, consistent with the TRC. Where protocols are affirmed and respectfully implemented. Then traditional and ancestral knowledge is the right of each First Nation. Inclusion is important, so that's why we always make sure elders, youth, children, they have that opportunity to be here. Indigenous worldviews will support the braiding of traditional and ancestral knowledge with other knowledge systems. See, the term ancestral knowledge, that became out of the table, because they really want to emphasize like the knowledge is also about the history of who they are. Like they want to show that. And then also respect for oral traditions, cultures, supported the transmission of sharing of that knowledge. And then we really made sure we had a conflict resolution regarding share interpretation and application of that knowledge will occur through respectful convergence of First Nation and Western processes. So I guess really what we wanted to emphasize is that if there is some sort of conflict, that we'll have a way to respectfully approach it. So that's why so these 10 principles, they guide each of our meetings. So that's how we open it up along with that inclusion model. And that's information that we'll share with implementation teams. So when they're working within the First Nations table, that they know this is what is important to the table. And to incorporate it into their work, right? Like a protocol, respect for the knowledge sharing. Okay, Indigenous knowledge policy. Okay, so this is another initiative that the government is currently undertaking. Did anybody aware of it? Nobody? Wow, okay. It's on the website, so I encourage you guys to take a look. So Indigenous Relations Ministry is leading this policy review. And what it's gonna be, I'm gonna get more into the collaboration, not really the content. But it's developing a policy to guide how Alberta government can consider and respectfully apply traditional knowledge in land and resource systems. The Alberta government recognizes the value and unique perspectives of that ecological knowledge offers and respect of sacred nature of this topic. So they'll work closely with all three, with First Nations and Métis. And the initiative is intended to support the protection of this knowledge and allow for respectful opportunities for Indigenous individuals, communities, and organizations to contribute towards the best possible environmental planning and management for Alberta. You know, I really hope that this will be an empowerment tool for Indigenous groups and Alberta government. Because I know one thing that I always stress is about if you're uncomfortable when you're working with Indigenous people, get that support you need to be able to feel comfortable. But I also know when you're working in that environment, if you're not comfortable, it's really harder to speak about it, at the table. So that's why when I say mean to empower, it's about empowering our GOA staff too, like to be able to speak to an Indigenous issue and opportunity. So this is a model for Indigenous inclusion and collaboration. And what happened is they actually met with approximately 70 Indigenous groups, First Nations and Métis, so they can provide their input and insight for this Indigenous knowledge policy. So what that engagement was, that initial engagement, was to discuss scope and intention of the policy, and then form the engagement. So what happened? So collaboration, because we know if you're going to create something for Indigenous people, you got to lead it with Indigenous people. So what they did is they created a joint working group from cross-ministry staff and Indigenous elders and technicians from different linguistic groups. So what they did is the linguistic groups in Alberta, they made sure that they had representation from each of those rather than by treaties or nations, because that would be a lot. So that's how they created that collaboration. And what they did is the joint working group and government staff, what the next step is they're going to use what they learned from those initial engagements and then co-create a draft policy, which the joint working group is currently working on now. It's important that the Indigenous knowledge policy is co-created between Indigenous groups and government, and it's important there is time for collaborative discussions, ceremony, and protocol are adhered and followed with the joint working group. So what part of it now is that they have a subset write-in team that is going through their iterations to draft this policy. I'm almost done. And then engagement on this draft policy is now occurring with those 70 groups, and the government will inform industry partners and other key stakeholders on this initiative. So they did that in summer, and this draft policy is developed for fall 2018. So stay tuned. And when the province-wide Indigenous knowledge policy is approved, it will enable and articulate principles and best practices at a regional level, and it will support the draft SSRP TK principles, the ones that I mentioned earlier. So the success of this table is by having Indigenous people lead the table. So what I do is I always encourage hiring Indigenous people to be part of your team, or even just partnering with Indigenous organizations, if you're taking the initiative to lead Indigenous projects. And then just train Indigenous people to become planners. So that's something that would be a definite opportunity for you. And I think that's it. So my next slides is Bill is going to be presenting on, I guess, a case study with an SSRP. I know that's the planner word. So this is some of the funding that they've used to implement that funding. And I just really want to also make people aware is that this presentation, we actually presented it at our last meeting, me and Bill, because I really wanted to make sure the table is aware, they provide their input, and best of all, they support, most important. Because I just thought it was really I don't know if it's the right word, but for me to come present on my own, even though I know I'm First Nation, but I just thought it was really to exclude, because the success of this table is the nations. So that's why I had to make sure for true collaboration is that me and the nations are here co-presenting together. Okay? Yep. Okay, there you go.
Let's all give Glennis a big round of applause. And I'll just put a shameless plug. For 3 years, I attended the meetings of the SSRP First Nation subtable when I was with a different organization. And it's pretty powerful to see a room full of people speaking their own language, sharing knowledge and advice to the government of Alberta, and have that relationship building on display. It's pretty amazing. So now I'd like to introduce Bill, and he'll give us his presentation.
Amboa Stitch, good morning. I'll be doing a presentation on the Stony Nakota Grizzly Report. And this is a report that we did in conjunction also with Environment Canada, as well as the Government of Alberta with Environment and Parks. And it was completed back in 2016 after a number of years of trying to source some funding for similar kinds of study. The Grizzly Report itself is available online, and I can give you the link. I believe the link is on one of the slides here towards the end of the presentation. One of the pictures that I'm showing here, I know it's not within the Kananaskis. It's a view of the Lake Louise, and it is a partial view of the hotel from the trail going up to Plain of Six Glaciers. The reason why I included this picture in the beginning is just to convey a little bit of that understanding around what we see and what we understand. So not seeing the hotel, not seeing the full scope of the lake is very similar to a lot of the research that's going on now. We understand places, wildlife from one perspective, not necessarily from all perspectives. And based on that, we don't see entirely what's out there. So if this was my only view of Lake Louise, I'd be missing a whole bunch. So just to kind of convey that idea of that there's meanings out there in the world based on our perspective. And if we change our perspective, we might see a little bit more. So the Grizzly study is centered right in this area here in Kananaskis. And one of the main study areas that we focused on was the Galatea Creek area, which is a little bit south of here, just beyond Wedge Pond. And we focused, that was one of our focus areas, but we also looked at areas coming into Kananaskis and going out mainly through the Elbow Valley and through Canmore. But there are a number of other places that, are used by wildlife to get in and out of Kananaskis. The problem at the time was that we were seeing a bit more incidents happening in the Kananaskis area. We were seeing, in certain cases, trailers being tipped over, trucks getting their bumpers ripped off, and quite a few incidents between trail hikers and grizzly bears. And when we had talked to parks about it, they had ways of dealing with it, but we felt like they weren't really understanding what some of the problems were, what some of the issues were for the grizzly bears. And so that's sort of the purpose of the report, was to look at this area, look at this wildlife behavior differently, and to try and explain it in a little different fashion. And so that's why when we looked again at some of the incidents that were happening back at that time, there were largely incidents that were where grizzly bears were defensive in nature, where they were coming across more people and activity in certain areas that, and they were reacting badly to it. So the purpose of the report was just to give that alternative explanation of how grizzly bears are reacting to developments in the Kananaskis area. The first, the Indigenous inclusion model, the slide from Glynis's presentation, one of the, in that central circle, one of the bullets in there was talking about the inclusion of traditional environmental knowledge. and including that as part of a policy framework, and also the Indigenous stewardship practices. So that's basically what we're talking about in terms of the report recommendations, of which I'll get to. I'm not going to go over all of the report recommendations, but I'll cover off some of the more important ones in the time that we have. But basically, that number 3, using traditional knowledge to provide insight into potential management resources identified. That is basically the real driver behind the report. And like I said, we were having difficulty trying to find a source of funding for this study prior to 2016. And it's really important, I think, to recognize that, because when we do get funding to do different kinds of research or traditional use studies, those are largely in areas that we may not really be, it may be peripheral to some of the more important areas that we want to look at. So depending on if there was a pipeline, or if there was a road being constructed in one of these areas, our traditional use study would be relegated to whatever project area that is. Whereas with the Grizzly study, we got to pick specifically Galatea Creek. So that's kind of the difference between the funding that's available and the funding that's not available. And in many cases, the funding that we need to do studies on these types of areas is not available. And that's why the table is so important, the SSRP table, because we can go out into some of these areas that we don't have regular program funding to do site visits or do gathering in these areas, because, you know, by and large, those kind of funding pots are not available. And I'll touch on that towards the end here with the work that's happening with the Canadian Mountain Network. So again, Galatea Creek is the area that we wanted to focus on, and there's a lot of these issues are interrelated, so we just try to break up the recommendations into some general areas, and we didn't want to be very specific about the recommendations, because we wanted to have that sort of as an open interpretive discussion with parks. We don't want to impose a very limited definition of what this recommendation is, and because we don't agree on that definition, we're not going to do it. We just said, here are generally the recommendations. Let's meet with parks and see how we can implement. In the report, one of the things that we were talking about, or that we had discussed, was this idea around prejudicial government policies. Prior to 1951, there were a lot of different policies that were in place under the Indian Act, and we had very repressive policies in place at that time. The reason why that's important today is because some of our elders still believe that they're going to be persecuted for sharing their traditional knowledge. So elders within our community, there are many that I work with and have worked with over the years, but there are also elders that I cannot work with who still believe this is part of how government operates. The picture I included here was of a man by the name of Mark Bennett Peacock. He's the man standing on the far right-hand side of the picture. This is an honoring ceremony that was done for him back in 1937 at the Banff Indian Days. Mark Bennett Peacock was a lawyer who participated in World War I, and when he returned, did a lot of advocacy work for different bands, including the Stonies. And I guess the reason why he was important is because he would later represent Stoney in defending some of our hunting rights in a case called Rex versus Wesley that was decided, or that was brought about in 1932. The reason why 1932 is important is because right in that period of prejudicial policies was 1927 and 1951, when the government had restrictions around legal representation of Indigenous people. So it was a very difficult period, but still, I like to think that because of this case, because the hunting rights were defended, I always like to think that the Stonies had hunting rights before voting rights, which occurred, after 1961. So important policies out there, important periods to remember that are still part of our healing process. And I think that's why, we have all of these different studies, or we have all these different parts that are coming about, like the UN Declaration with the 46 articles. We have the 94 calls to action from the TRC, and presumably we will have more recommendations come out of a missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry. But all these studies are starting to pile up, and we're not really acting on them. And so I think it's important to just say that, we have a history of not working very well with government, and so we've still got to fight through some of that in order to get to some of the solutions that we need. One of the areas one of the recommendations that we talk about in the report is restricted activity, and specifically in that Galatea Creek area. I think that what's important to note here is we're not saying restricted activity just because, just to shut it all down and have nobody in there. We're saying we want restricted activity for a certain period of time for a certain place. That's because our understanding of place is different in traditional knowledge than it is in Western science. I've included some of the authors here that we included in the report: Dr. Marie Batiste, Daniel Wildcat, and the late Vine Deloria. They've written a lot in the last 10, 15 years around how to understand those differences of place in Western science and in traditional knowledge. So we tried to explain a bit of that in this report. And again, the recommendation of restricted activity is based on that understanding of that traditional knowledge. We're not biologists, we're not conservationists, we're not wildlife experts. Our stories and our reasoning comes from our oral history and our language. So that's how we interpreted this recommendation of restricted activity. And it's still probably one of the biggest discussion points that we have right now with the government of Alberta. I understand that Galatea is a very beautiful place. It's a very popular hiking area for a lot of residents, a lot of groups, a lot of travel groups come through specifically to hike that trail. And I know, our summers are short, and I know that a lot of people use that area, but I think where we're at with this, with making this recommendation is we're recognizing that we're not the only ones out on these landscapes as human beings. We've got to share this landscape with wildlife, and especially these important cultural places for wildlife. We have to make time and space for them. And so that's really the driver, I guess, behind the restricted activity. Not just to shut it down because anybody can say, let's shut it down for a certain period of time. We're saying we want to shut it down because we know that there's a certain time when grizzly bears are going to be up in this particular area. And we know that because of our stories and our language. And so we have to respect their time and space to be up in these areas. And again, it's still part of the discussion going on with Alberta Parks. One of the other recommendations from the report is ongoing cultural monitoring. We had to describe in the report what we were doing out on the landscape. So when our people are out on the landscape, they're looking at all types of indicators, plant growth, footprints, accessibility of water, even the wind direction, how the wind flows in certain areas. So all of that's happening while our people are out on the landscape. They're taking all those things into account when they're out there. So we had to come up with a definition around that, and this is what we came up with. That's in the report on cultural monitoring. Cultural monitoring is going to mean different things, is going to have different meanings in different places. So in northern BC, it'll have a different definition, might even take on a name like community-based monitoring, like in NWT and Yukon and other places. So this is still evolving, this type of monitoring, but it's the best term that we used. Well, it's the best term at the time that we used to try to associate this meaning with what we were doing. Cultural monitoring is something that we're still in discussion with, especially around the Traditional Knowledge Working Group with the province. I also belong to the Traditional Knowledge Working Group. The meetings that we've had in the last couple of months since April, and we are working on the principles and other ways to incorporate cultural monitoring into the policy. So, hopefully that work will be done here. It'll be ongoing work. I'm hoping probably into next year. So, we'll see how that unfolds. We've had the good fortune to work with Alberta Parks on different types of events. So this is a picture from 2017 down over at the Evan Thomas, just before one of the burn programs was about to commence. We did a ceremony with the Alberta Parks people, and that was in I believe in April of that year. So there's not all this fog and smoke in the air. It's actually clear on that day, and these are the kind of things I think that we need to keep in mind as part of that. Indigenous inclusion is following also those Indigenous practices, the things that we're looking at for if we're going to be following and doing the inclusion model. Connectivity is another recommendation from the report. When we think of connectivity, this is usually what we think of, the big wildlife crossings in Banff, traveling from Banff townsite to Lake Louise. A very good step in my thinking is that this is a very good way to do connectivity. It's expensive. It took a lot of years to get this to do this, but I think this is one solution that's really working. And there are a number of connectivity points in along the Trans-Canada in that area. But outside of this area, all around the rest of the eastern slopes, there's not much. And so that doesn't mean there's no connectivity issues there. It just means that it's not a big deal. So this is why we're saying in the report, we need more connectivity, especially here in the Kananaskis. Wildlife have a great barrier here to the north, Trans-Canada Highway, pipelines, hydro developments, all these different linear developments have been going on for years and years and years. Wildlife don't have a great way of getting across the Bow River and all through all those highways and then to get onto the north side. So it's a very important pinch point that's happening. And it is, and this is why we've said we need more connectivity. Really, there's only 2 points here, the one at Dead Man's Flats and the one just east of the town side of Canmore. And there is sort of a wildlife crossing over at the Canada Trail near Banff. But dedicated wildlife crossing, something like this, an overland pass, do we have that today? No. That goes across the Trans-Canada. And there is talk. There is talk of doing something in and around east of the Dead Man's Flats area, on which we are open to and supportive of. But, you know, when we think about planning and revitalizing areas, we often think about just the industrial side and not the impact that wildlife have. Wildlife have a function on landscapes, an environmental function, and also a cultural function. And so that's why we're saying connectivity is really important. So just wanted to touch on that for the recommendations. And I think I'll skip ahead to one of the last slides here is this. We were able to do the ceremony recommendation earlier this year. There's a place not far from here, east of Canmore, the Alpine Ski Club of Canada. That area is basically was a gathering point for the Stoney Indians when they were traveling to Banff. So they'd all camp there, and today it's known as Indian Flats. And we were able to work with the Alpine Club to do a ceremony up there just this past spring. Everything went well. We had good representation from parks as well as from the Alpine Club, and I think that it's important to start out in this way in working with groups, just like the pipe ceremonies that are done at all the meetings. A very important part of the culture. This is the address for the report on the Canadian Mountain Network. And again, the Canadian Mountain Network is important because the NCE application right now has been submitted, and it is being considered by Government of Canada. And if it is successful, we won't find out until November, December this year. But if it is successful, then it will basically become another funding agency towards traditional use studies, like the Grizzly Report. And I think that's really the part that we're missing in a lot of our research, is understanding that traditional knowledge side. So again, the report's here and it's free and open for everyone to look at it. Ishniish, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So you may have noticed we're at time, but our neighbors next door are going until 11:50, so we've made the executive decision that we get 20 more minutes too. So we have kind of two options, speaking with Glynis and Bill. We could do a normal Q&A session, or we could do maybe more of a workshop, table facilitated conversation. I'm going to go by nods and heads. Who would prefer to have a Q&A session with Bill and Glynis? Hands, okay, I'll use hands. And who would like to have maybe more table discussion? Okay, Q&A it is. So I'll float around with the mic, and if anybody has a question, put your hand up, and I'll try to make it to as many people as I can in the next 15 or so minutes. So who wants to kick it off? Anybody who put up their hand voting for Q&A, I'm assuming you have a question, so we'll start with you.
Thank you, Bill, for the prayer this morning, and thank you, Bill and Glynis, for the presentations. It was very interesting and informative for us. I guess I have one question for each of you. Glynis, and I'll just give the questions and then sit down, but Glynis, the question for you is around, you talked about collaboration between the nations, so I'm just wondering if you could share a couple stories or examples of that. Just something, for us to get a little more insight into how that went or what some of those relationships resulted in between the nations. And then, Bill, I guess I'm curious about the sort of the cultural significance or the meaning of the bear in the Stoney culture, and or if there's some stories that you might want to share about that. Thank you.
I don't know if this is on. Oh, is it on? Oh, so to answer your question, Brian, I'm just thinking about. So most recently, we worked on those work plans that I said that the nations prepare because we're at a timeline. So I actually, and it was really valuable, like in terms of preparing those, because I actually went to go see each of these nations, either on the phone or just even like individually. I drove all the way to Picani, came back. But what was, I guess, the relationship though is that, like we just met for coffee. And sometimes it's funny because we met in Fort Macleod and none of the coffee shops were open other than Tim Hortons. They're like, Glynis, come meet me at 10. He's like, geez, Glynis, there's nothing open here. But like because of our relationship, we're flexible that way. I just went to go see. They said, come meet me here. Some of the other nations there, I was supposed to meet them at Rocky Mountain House, but they said, I'm really busy, Glynis. Can you come out to the reserve and just come to our admin? So, and I don't mind, because that's part of the relationship. And I also know, like, things don't start on time. Or is that we said we were going to meet at 1, but they might call me and say, Glynis, can you be here at 12:30? So I'm trying to rearrange my schedule, which is, like, no issue. But I think part of that relationship is being able to be flexible like that. But also, I've attended a lot of their, because what I value most about the table is the lifelong friendships that I've gained, and new elders, new mentors. So I've been to some of their celebrations. Other than going to powwows, they've invited me to feasts of their families that I go to. And it's out of, respect and friendship. And I totally encourage other people to do it. So that's what I really appreciate about the table.
Thank you for the question. The importance of grizzly bears in many cultures is that the grizzly bear is seen in many ways as a guardian or like a caretaker over medicines. And so when you see them out on these landscapes, when they come out of hibernation, they're always going back and visiting a lot of spots for berries. And berries are also used, berries and leaves, plants. They're used kind of in conjunction when we go to prepare medicines or when we go to food preparation. And so grizzly bear is very important. We have songs. A lot of our outfits, ceremonial outfits and artifacts are fashioned from grizzly parts, and we respect. We don't just go charging off into any area that we want. We are respectful of their places out on landscapes, and And in the ceremonial sense, they're very important because when we do our ceremonies, sometimes the spirit of those animals will come to us in our dreams. And so it's a very respectful and spiritual relationship. So it's you can't explain that in Western science. You can only explain that and have meaning in traditional knowledge. In Western science, it's an animal that we dominate and that we can control, and sometimes we use the fur and sometimes we don't, and it's becoming more and more of a nuisance now because they're showing up in Deerfoot Trail in northwest Calgary and all these other places. We see black bears and moose and more elk showing up. But in traditional knowledge, it's a very different relationship and a very different understanding.
I saw somebody come in the door and give me the tapping on the watch sign. So we got time for one quick question, and then hopefully a good answer, and then we can wrap it up.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering, in your experience of creating a very Indigenous culture with Government of Alberta, do you experience resistance anywhere? And if you do, where's that coming from?
Nope. No, we definitely. But I feel like with resistance, when I talk about relationships, right, like that's where you have to develop the relationship with the people you're working with. Because even, you have to develop trust, respect, like with anybody else that you work with. But I think, I guess it's really from when they don't understand, I guess, where that frustration is coming from. Because a lot of the frustrations, like Bill mentioned, is from like the stuff that just happened recently, right? Like, and especially like the residential schools, and I think when they don't recognize that's where that anger is coming from, like that's where we have to teach our staff to be able to feel empowered, like to work with Indigenous people. That's how I guess I see it.
Yeah, well, historically, there's been a lot of resistance to including Indigenous groups and some of the things that they want to do by government. Traditionally, that's not been a very good relationship. I think that part of that too is our education system. It's, for example, if we had Native studies or learning about Treaty 7 as a foundation that everyone in post-secondary would learn, maybe that would alleviate some of it. But in this day and age, we still don't have Native studies as a core faculty among all of our universities and post-secondaries. So there's a bit of work to do there on the education side. And I think it's a good step for government to be working on the cultural awareness aspect that they are working on. But until we get that more widely known information out, people don't like what they don't understand. And so you're always going to have resistance to any kind of ideas, whether it's a grizzly report or any other. People don't have that background and understanding of First Nations, and that resistance will always be there.
Okay. Let's have one last big round of applause for everybody, and thank you for the couple questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
So on behalf of APPI and the conference, we want to thank both of our presenters for their time and their knowledge, and we'll have a small gift of our appreciation. And thank you to you for the questions and your patience and willingness to participate in this really important conversation. So thank you.